Hello, folks. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm going to share a screen with you, laptop, and then how. What I've been finding striking is the more I read about Adam Smith, the more I see the a similarity between economic thinking in India, at least of the older generation economists, say people of the vintage of say Yoginder Alag or Manmohan Singh, and the overall Smithian kind of thinking about economic growth processes. So what I'll also try to do is to draw the parallels between once I've sort of done through what Smith was actually saying. Okay, I try to draw parallels with what happened with economic thinking in India, and especially the how India modified the Washington Consensus to actually implement a much slower and much more nuanced liberalization process in the country. And we will then see how did it work from a Smithian perspective, because as we have I've emphasized again, and we have you know we have sort of seen that Smith was primarily concerned with what happens to the poorest in society. Yeah. So what happened with poverty? You see, because traditionally Indian policy making was also very closely engaged with poverty. India is a massive country with huge amounts of poverty, and you must, uh, I think whatever we blame the early architects of Indian economic policy for, one must always remember that it was the early founding fathers of Indian independent India's economic policy who sort of created this long-term emphasis on poverty reduction in the country as a primary goal. Okay, and for all that matters, we it's not really true that the Indian economy was that I think traditionally now for some time after economic reforms in India in 1991, it became more or less fashionable to blame socialist patterns of economic growth before 91 as responsible for poverty and responsible for slow economic growth. And then 1991 have ushered in a rapid economic growth. Right, so everybody that's if you look at most of the debate in India, most of the literature in India, they would say that economic growth took off. You had periods of slow economic growth from 1951 to 2000 to 1991, and in 1991 you have this sudden rapid jump in India's economic rate of economic growth. And then we also have called the 1950s to the 1991 the Hindu rate of growth because the economy was slow, right? And it was supposed to be some traditional Indian economy kind of a growth. Well, what we tried to do is, there are a lot of people who actually tried to date at what point does India's economic growth show a jump, you know, a long-term kind of a jump. And there are many econometric methods of doing this. So if you have a time series, for example, of data, then you can actually identify dates for time points at which long-term shifts in this data happen. And a whole host of economists have tried to do this from using Indian economy data from 1951 to 2000s, whatever. And then there was debate about whether the growth shift happened in 1980s or 1990s, etc. So me and my co-author Amrish Dongre decided to look at the issue a little differently. So there was a very, I think, an unsung hero for the Indian economic history tradition called Professor Mr. Shiv Subramanian, who very carefully sat down and created national income estimates for India for every year from 1900 to 2000. This is a very famous book by Shiv Subramanian called India's National Income 1900 to 2000. So for every year, he carefully computed and created a continuous time series from 1900 to 2000. And then we said, why not? Why only restrict yourself to look at to finding the year which gives you the biggest jump, by using this data from 1951 to 2000. We have the entire time series of the overall century. And let's find out which was the biggest growth jump for the century as a whole, not only for the period after 1950, but if you include the period after 1950 and also include the period before 1950, we decided to find out which is the biggest kind of a growth jump. Okay. And so what we did was we actually used the very same techniques for the entire time period between 1900 to 2000 to find out the biggest growth jump, the year of the biggest growth jump. Okay. And you'll be very surprised to know that that biggest growth jump was not in 1991, not in 1980s, but in 1951, the year of economic planning, the year of the reviled socialist economic growth patterns, etc., etc. Because we all agree that something like 2.5% to 3% was slow, but before 1951, the Indian economy was actually contracting per capita basis for about minus 0.01% growth or something, right? So it was 1951 actually was a very big growth jump. Okay, but having said that, let me come back to Smith, and so what I'll try to do is to we'll see what Smith was saying and some important lessons that we have from Smith. Then we'll see how Indian economy how Indian economic thinking kind of reflects this median vision. And let's see what is the data. Did it work in the way Smith envisaged it would work? That is, did it really lift people out of poverty? And then we will see what the lessons learned from that story are. Okay, and then some concerns that all of us, or at least I seriously have about that whole strategy. Yeah. So I'm now sharing my screen. Yeah. Right. So we're thinking of understanding how ideas were formed, right? How Smith came to think the way he did. And we looked at all the set of influences on Smith and how, what basically led to his thinking. Because one must remember very clearly that ideas don't grow in a vacuum, they grow in a specific context, and there is always a history to those ideas. Okay, and I'm going to soon show you something very interesting where actually the ideas which you see in textbooks in macroeconomics, for example, right, all your IS curves, LM curves going up and down, and the Phillips curves and everything actually are derived from a specific political and historical context, right? So there were ideas which grew in their political debates. They grew in certain, they grew in a specific context, and then some intelligent person actually put them into curves and graphs and equations, and then they became policy and they became textbooks, and that's what we learn, right? Okay. So going back to, so therefore it's always important to think of how ideas came about, right? Okay. So we have private vice and public virtue. That's what we've been discussing. Uh, you know, the basic idea, the basic problem was that if you have, if you have man as in the fallen state, right? Then how do you have virtuous action, right? How do you understand human virtue? And the argument was that really human virtue is actually vice disguised as virtue. But nevertheless, private vices can actually contribute to public virtue, right? So, for example, if you look at the very famous book by Bernard Mandeville, okay, Mandeville wrote a it's kind of much discussed thing in economics called uh, there is a book called The Fable of the Bees, right? So, what did Mandeville write in that, right? Okay. So basically, so private vices and public benefits. That was the subtitle of Mandeville's influential Fable of the Bees written in 1714, right? So basically, what Mandeville suggested was that civilization would come to a halt if men and women actually acted according to the moral standards they professed, right? So Mandeville held that attempts to promote virtuous behavior were futile and even counterproductive, and suggested that public good was the product of egoistic motives. Mandeville suggested a more efficient approach to the promotion of virtuous behavior. So I quote Mandeville: "Whoever would civilize men and establish them into a body politic must be thoroughly acquainted with all the passions and appetites, strength and weaknesses of their frame, and understand how to turn their greatest frailties to the advantage of the public." Unquote. So, according to Mandeville, the task of the legislator, in words, policymaker, was not to repress men's egoistic impulses, but to provide institutional channels through which they could be asserted for the ultimate benefit of the public. So, it's really how you design institutions, right? Uh, so, properly contrived social framework would perform the function more or less automatically without the direct intervention of the legislator or the policymaker. So, you actually have a machine. If you can create correct institutions which would be incentive compatible, right, which would then translate sort of private vices into public benefits, right? So basically, so two broad strategies were kind of suggested for harnessing man's natural passions to institutional means to serve the common good. The first was to preserve or create institutions, which would pit otherwise malicious motives against one another. So basically, counterbalancing, right? The strategy of counterbalancing competing egoistic motives is very evident in Adam Smith's treatment of market competition in the wealth of nations. So what does market competition really do? It kind of counterbalances egoistic motives to lead to what is beneficial to society. The second strategy, which says, according to the second strategy, some modes of self-love, if channeled through social institutions, can be made to contribute to morally desirable conduct. Right? So this was a strategy which lay behind Smith's theory of moral sentiments, in which he showed subtly and convincingly that social institutions could channel self-love into decent and sometimes virtuous behavior. Yeah. So, for example, Smith wrote in the theory of moral sentiments, right? In the passage in the theory of moral sentiments dealing with the relationship between our perceptions of beauty and utility, Smith argued that people are often motivated to promote the public welfare by the aesthetic satisfaction they derive from contemplating the workings of a coherent system. That's a very interesting point here. So he says, when a patriot is a policymaker, when a patriot exerts himself for the improvement of any part of public policy, again I'm quoting Smith, okay, when a patriot exerts himself for the improvement of any part of the public policy, his conduct does not always arise from pure sympathy with the happiness of those who are to reap the benefit of it. We will be eager to promote the happiness of our fellow creatures, rather from a view to perfect and improve a certain beautiful and orderly system than from any immediate sense of feeling of what they either suffer or enjoy. If you would implant public virtue in the breast of him who seems heedless of the interest of his country, it will often be of no purpose to tell him what superior advantages the subjects of a well-governed state enjoy, that they are better lodged, that they are better clothed, that they are better fed. These considerations will commonly make no great impression. You will be more likely to persuade if you describe the great system of public policy which procures these advantages, if you explain the connections and dependencies of its several parts, their mutual subordination to one another, and their general subserviency to the happiness of the society. If you show how this system might be introduced into his own country, what it is that hinders it from taking place there at present, how these obstructions might be removed, and all the several wheels of the machine of government be made to move with more harmony and smoothness, without waiting upon one another, or mutually retarding one another's motions. It is scarce possible that a man should listen to a discourse of this kind and not feel himself animated to some degree of public spirit. Upon this account, political dispositions, if just and reasonable and practicable, are of all the works of speculation the most useful. They serve to animate the public passions of men and rouse them to seek out the means of promoting the happiness of the society. Unquote. I can't tell you how much happiness a bureaucrat receives from a well-crafted GR, right? Okay, so it's more than the actual benefit of the people who the GR is meant to be. It's just the system. The beauty of the system of a well-formed GR actually is very, so basically the idea here is then to create a system, right? To create a system of and that is the kind of a system of political. What is the system in Smith's mind? The system in Smith's mind was again of two things that we have talked about. One, so allowing people, how do you kind of harness people's profit motives, people's self-love, people's focus on their own welfare into designing a larger system which works for everybody. So you exploit the basic human tendencies to drug barter and exchange. There are gains to be made from exchange. So you utilize that, okay, by creating a system where when people trade with each other, remove restrictions on trade, right? Okay, so you have more or less free kind of a liberal kind of a market system, and with a liberal market system, you actually then harness people's individual selfishness into something which works for the liberal plan for Smith, right? So the idea there is that if prices somewhere are too high, right, compared to what they ought to be naturally, right, then obviously resources from other sectors of the economy will flow into this sector, and because there will be increased supply in this sector, prices would fall, and by and large you would have a sector where wages are fair, where profits are minimal, and everybody benefits. Okay, now the key to this of course is division of labor, as we have seen, because what division of labor does is increases efficiency, and as the division of labor expands, it expands markets, and as markets expand, it increases the scope for trade, and with increased scope for trade, also the scope of increased division of labor. So you probably, so if you have you have a system where there is great increased efficiency of transactions, right, and there is a larger number of transactions. Okay, and at the same time, because of the liberal plan, because because of competition, right, because lack of restrictions on okay, because there are no restrictions on trade, uh, prices are equalized, profits are minimal, wages are as high as they can be, right? Okay, and that's the kind of a plan which Smith had in mind, right? Okay, and what is Smith's paradox? What Smith started with was asking the question: why, for example, even when America has abundance of almost everything, why are generally people in America poorer than that in England? And that's where he actually, and that is where he said that what matters, what differentiates England from America is division of labor, organized production, right, and therefore increased markets. But Smith also believed that this whole process is hindered by powerful vested interests. So it's just not that competition happens automatically, right? And so Smith was very clear in this, right? Smith was very clear understanding that there are vested interests, and vested interests would, for example, if competition would to reduce profits on trade, then merchants would come together, combine, and use their power as a lobbying group to ensure that policy, ensure that that competition is restricted, right? So Smith very clearly understood the power of vested interests in society, and the role of power of vested interests and rent seeking and lobbying, powerful lobbies, yeah, on as with on as kind of limitations on the kind of liberal plan that Smith envisaged. Right, so Smith was very aware of how markets could fail from that perspective. Right, in modern political economy terms, you call it market failure when you have large political interests, large vested interests, lobbies, which can actually control policy. Right. Okay. So Smith also has something on the short and long-term impact of colonial rule on India, where Smith said that, look here, had the East India Company been a government rather than a mercantile corporation, then it would have probably thought more fairly about India, right? So it would have actually paid more for what it bought from India, right? Okay, and sold what it sold in India at a far cheaper price than what a company like East India Company would do. Essentially, a profit motivating, which essentially is a company which is driven essentially by a profit motive, and therefore the East India Company sells everything in India very much costlier than what it can, and it buys from India at a much cheaper price than what. Uh, uh, what it should be paying, and therefore Smith actually had some idea of how economic drain was taking place from India to the UK under the under the East India Company. But he also said that in the long run, India would benefit because technological progress that has happened in the West would flow from the West to India through the colonial channels, and in the long run, countries like India would actually benefit from the colonial linkage. But in the short run, because the East India Company is a mercantile company, and was essentially interested in an unfair trade. So Smith had a clear understanding of power of interest, and that's very important today. So that brings me to the second slide. Okay, what is Smith's? So basically, I'm going to argue that Smith's approach is very close to the policy thinking in India, right? Compared to say other countries, right? Because Indian economic policy was very strongly right from the 1950s concerned about massive widespread poverty in India, and that India was a modernizing economy, but its role was to actually uplift people from poverty. So whether fruits of economic growth actually reach the poorest people in society was very much a concern for India, and as you can see, at least immediately after 1991. Almost in all policies of the government of India, you actually see uh, at least lip service. So, for example, if you ask an Indian economist, why do you want rapid economic growth? The typical answer would be that we want rapid economic growth because it pulls people out of poverty. And the entire policy discussion on poverty, so there is a lot of focus in Indian economic literature on the relationship between fast economic growth and poverty eradication, right? Okay, so that's I think that is very much a Smithian kind of a thinking. Yeah, so most Indian economists do recognize that growth by itself is of not much value. What matters is really whether that growth is useful, whether it leads to people, it leads uh, to people moving out of poverty, right? So that's so therefore, you know, Indian economic reforms, as all of you know, Indian economic reforms started in 1991. And I would take you to two very interesting books, which I think all of you should read. One is a book called The Half Lion, okay, which is a biography of P.V. Narasimha Rao by I forget the name of the author, but the Half Lion. Half Lion is a so you basically get a very very interesting kind of a view on how actually the political thinking about the 1991 economic reforms took place, right? And in a sense, the 1991 economic reforms were happening because they were forced upon us, and they're forced upon a government which had already politically committed, at least politically committed to poverty reduction, right? And generally having a socialist pattern of society, right? And therefore, even when you talked about macroeconomic stabilization and in general market friendly processes, you always had to couch it in terms of poverty reduction because there was a history of 50 years, 40 years of economic policy which had essentially grown, which essentially centered around a discourse which privileged equality, reduction in inequality, social justice, and so on and so forth, right? So therefore, even after 1991, so that's one of the reasons why, for example, in the thinking about Indian economic growth has remained rather Smithian. Yeah. Okay. And there is another book called The 3 Months That Changed the the 1991 3 months that changed the world by Jairam Ramesh, right? So those two books I think you should, all of you should read if you are interested in actually how politics and economics move together, and how important political discourse and political management is to actually creating economic policy. Yeah, so you must read that, right? Okay. So therefore, in a sense, the 1991 Indian reforms have been different from the Washington Consensus. What is the Washington Consensus? Around the 1990s, many economies were developing economies. So on the one hand, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and there were many economies which were actually emerging out of the wreckage of the old Soviet Union, which were clearly, and all of you know that the Soviet Union was not a market-based economy. So many economies are making that transition to market-based economic development. At the same time, there are also many underdeveloped or developing countries, as they used to be called at that time, right? First used to be called third world countries, underdeveloped countries, and developing economies, which are by 1991 run into severe macroeconomic problems, especially problems of balance of payments. Yeah, because many of these countries had rather inward-looking economic development strategies. They had not bothered to develop competitive domestic sectors which could actually export goods and services to the rest of the world, and therefore normally had historically accumulated large balance of payments issues. Typically, these countries would have controlled exchange rates, right? Artificially repressed exchange rates, and therefore large, and also had large domestic inflation. Double-digit inflation was very common. So those countries were having macroeconomic imbalances, and countries like India were finding that whole thing becoming quite unsustainable. We really didn't have, for example, more than 2 weeks left of really foreign exchange to even pay for our oil bills and other things. So there was a kind of a bankruptcy facing many countries like this. And so at the time the multilateral organizations decided to help, but they said we'll help you if you actually put your house in order, because otherwise we'll not help you. And the rules they imposed is known as the Washington Consensus. What did the Washington Consensus consist of? It consisted of three pillars, right? Macroeconomic stabilization. Macroeconomic stabilization meaning getting your fiscal deficit in order. So making sure that the government doesn't spend so much as it was doing earlier. Making sure that the country's exchange rate is market driven. It's not artificially restricted. And ensuring, so basically that was macroeconomic stabilization. Okay, reducing balance of payments deficits, reducing fiscal deficits, making sure that inflation was under control. Yeah, so that's it. Opening up of the economy for trade and investment. That was the second pillar. So freeing the country where for essentially trade and investment. So opening on the current account and the capital account, and within the economy expanding market forces. So privatization within the economy, right? Encouraging competition within the economy. These were three pillars of Washington Consensus. And many countries proceeded very fast along the Washington Consensus, but India did not. India went rather slowly. So we first quickly put in place macroeconomic stabilization. We sort of could very quickly sort of put caps on our fiscal deficits, how much the government was spending, yeah, and also kind of made our exchange rate regime more market determined. Our interest rates started to went from being administered interest rates to being more market determined interest rates. So macroeconomic stabilization happened. We also opened the country for trade, but not for investment. The opening of the Indian economy for investment has been very, very, very slow, and there were a lot of debates about whether we should actually open on the capital account, because and for a variety of reasons. But there we have been slow, and also privatization within the country, within the economy, within India has proceeded relatively slowly compared to the rest of the rest compared to many other countries. Yeah, so India did adopt the Washington Consensus, and all these things, mind you, especially opening of the trade and investment is very Smithian, right? Okay, right? Expansion of market forces within the economy is a very Smithian kind of an idea. Yeah. right? Macroeconomic stabilization, of course, Smith was not a macroeconomist, but opening up of the trade investment, expansion of market forces within the economy, continued are very close uh, to Smithian prescriptions of where an economy should go. Uh, yeah, they don't really so much look at the caveats of you know that Smith had about understanding the power of big corporations or understanding the of taking seriously the power of large industrial lobbies to actually control the course of economic policy in this country. And those caveats are now increasingly becoming important, uh, you know, for when there is whole discussion of crony capitalism. But we'll come to that at some point. So has it worked really? Okay, has it worked? So I'm going to take you through a very interesting paper by Martin Rebellion, okay, recently. Right, so has really the Smithian approach that we had in 1991 of opening the economy, of allowing market forces to step in, has the liberal project of Smith. Yeah, so what we'll say is have how much success have we made in kind of realizing Smith's liberal project. Okay, that is reaching growth to the poorest of the poor, right? Making the so ensuring a better life. So two things. Smith's liberal project, as you remember, 2 or 3 lectures ago, had two ingredients. One was reduction in inequality, right? Okay, and secondly, improvement in the lot of the poorest person. Right, that was the Smithian liberal project. And Smith said that if you open the economy up, if you remove restrictions on trade, and private enterprise, or in general productive activities, and if you allow the market, and essentially if you sort of utilize the synergy between the division of labor and the market size, then you would be able to realize the liberal project. That's how you actually constructed institutions, right? That was the institutional framework which Smith had in mind. So what really happened, right? Okay. So basically, so I'm going to read you through actually through Rebellion's paper. It's a small note, and then we can kind of discuss this, right? Okay. So over the last 60 years, in both development theory and policy discussions, there has been a lot of debate about poverty impacts of economic growth and structural transformation in developing countries. Right, so reliable evidence to inform these debates calls for good household surveys over time. Inferring trends with just a few observations can be hazardous, obviously. Now, among developing countries, India has the longest series of national household surveys suitable for tracking living conditions. As you know, there is a National Sample Survey Organization which brings about these surveys on these quinquennial surveys on consumer expenditure, rounds on consumer expenditure. So the last round was in 2012, the one before that was in 2009, and the one before that was in 2005-6. So basically, 2005-6, the next round was in 9-10, but because 9-10 was a drought year, again 2011-12, another round was taken. The next round was due on in 2017. That round has undertaken, but the government has, for some reason best known to itself, not released the data. Right? But so basically, we at least have data till 2012. Okay, right? So among developing countries, right? The surveys are reasonably comparable over time, since the basic survey instruments and the methods have changed rather little. So, of course, there has been some changes in the structure of the surveys, but otherwise, by and large, they're comparable, right? So, India provides a rich time series evidence, right, and which is unique for many developing countries, and for testing and quantifying the relationship between living standards of the poor and economic growth. So, really testing out whether Smith has been borne out, right? So, what are the debates in India's economic growth, right? Everybody knows that.
अरे बेबी ह्या कॅटलेट ठेवून खाणार आहेस का मारी बेबी
So as is well known, India's post-independence planners hoped that the country's urban-centered industrialization process would bring long-term gains to poor people, including. So, basic idea was that if you have large capital-intensive growth, and a large public sector, then that would kind of lead to labor absorption from agriculture. However, that hope was largely shattered by the evidence of the slow pace of poverty reduction in the period from independence until the 1980s. In explaining this, a number of observers pointed to the slow pace of labor absorption from agriculture associated with the more inward-looking and capital-intensive development path of this period. So, as is generally understood, the heavy industrialization, public sector-led growth path, and an inward-looking developmental strategy, right, of self-sufficiency, industrial self-sufficiency, meant that we could not absorb enough labor from agriculture to industry, and therefore agriculture remained low productivity and overburdened, and therefore the pace of poverty reduction was rather low, right, during this phase. The share of the urban population has been rising steadily over time in India, as everybody knows. So it was something like 17% in 1950, and which is around 30% today, a little over 13%. Okay. However, relative to the rest of the world, especially even in South Asia as a whole, or even lower middle income countries as a whole, this has been slow, right? The pace of urbanization has been relatively slow in India, and it is slow even compared to China. The trend rate of growth of India's net domestic product per capita in the 1958-1991 period was also just under 2%. The picture that emerges from the accumulating evidence from India's national sample surveys indicates that economic growth in India up to the start of the 1990s was slow, but it did reduce poverty, but slowly. Right? People like Martin Ravelion and Gaurav Dutt in an important paper in 1996 showed that the elasticity of the incidence of poverty with respect to mean household consumption was minus 1.3 over 58 to 1991. So every time mean household consumption went up by 1%, poverty actually declined by 1.3%. Okay, so that was the elasticity growth. So, but the growth rate itself was slow, right? Okay, so therefore, rate of growth rate of poverty reduction is also slow, right? But if you look at a little bit more clearly at the data, right? If you look at the rather deeper expressive data, then using data up to the early 90s, Ravelion and Dutt found that rural economic growth was more poverty reducing. So between 1950 to early 1990s, it was urban growth had very little impact on poverty. It was mainly rural economic growth that was poverty reducing, right? As well as the growth in the tertiary sector, mainly services. So between 1950 to 1991, early 90s, what really reduced poverty was not urban growth, was not manufacturing sector, was not the large public sectors which India put in place, right? But was largely growth in agriculture, growth in the rural sector, and growth in services, right? So it was services and now after 1991, right, this changed a little bit. Okay, right. So basically, also what had happened was another thing that Dutt and Ravelion found was that urban growth and secondary sector growth had adverse distributional effects, right? So while they reduced urban poverty a little bit, they also increased urban inequality quite a lot, right? So basically, urban growth. So there was, so from 1951 to mid of 1990s, urban growth actually just had small impacts on urban poverty, but actually led to large rise in inequality. So between so the kind of growth pattern that we had from 1951 to 1991, okay, if there was whatever reduction in poverty happened was largely because the rural economic grew, the service sector grew. Urban growth mostly only kind of reduced poverty a little bit, but also created large inequality. Now, economic reforms following the macroeconomic crisis of 91-92 marked a significant change in India's economic landscape, which ushered in a new phase of high economic growth. Growth rate of NDP per capita more than doubled in the period since 1992. There was much hope in India that the higher growth rates attained in the wake of the economic reforms would bring a faster pace of poverty reduction. But there have also been signs of rising inequality in the post-reform period, raising doubts about how much the poor have shared in the gains from higher growth rates. So what is the new evidence now? With the backdrop of the history of recent economic change in India, A new paper has revisited the implications for poverty of both the higher rates of growth and the pattern of growth. The structural imbalance in India's post-reform growth would be a concern for poverty reduction if the model linking poverty to growth had remained the same, notably with the rural and agricultural sector contributing most to poverty reduction. However, previous research found signs that the process of economic growth itself had been changing in India, making now urban economic growth more pro-poor in the post-reform period up to 2005-6. Right, so paper by Dutton Ravilian found that actually after 1991, urban growth had become more pro-poor. It had started to absorb more poor, right? It was more labor absorbing, right? It is important to know whether this pattern has continued in the more recent data, right? And actually a paper till about 2000, which studied India's economic poverty reduction from 5 to 12, found that why did poverty fell? It fell because of three things. It fell because there was a rise in unskilled labor wage. So rural unskilled labor wage went up. Why did it go up? Because fast economic growth in urban areas, especially construction, actually pulled a lot of labor from rural areas to urban areas, right? And this was a period when rural, the rural wage, even for unskilled workers, was going up. And as you know, if the wage rate of the rural unskilled worker goes up, then there was a significant dent in poverty. Also, what was happening was main source of income in the rural area were now going from being farms incomes to non-farm sources of income. Okay, right? So basically, what was happening was there were a lot of non-farm rural enterprise which was coming up. So people setting up shops, for example, a bicycle repair shop or a small factory, right? Or a small tanning unit, or say shops, right? Or those kind of activities where incomes were shifting from farm to non-farm sources. That paper also found that social programs, transfers like MG Narega also contributed to poverty. They're not the main sources of growth. Right. Okay. So basically, and this was also found by Dutt and Ravilian, who actually put together a new data series to look at what was happening. Right. Okay. So they found that yes, poverty reduction had escalated. Okay, significantly. Poverty was now falling at almost 2.5% per year. Right. A lot of that poverty was happening because now the urban growth had now become more pro-poor. So urban growth was actually contributing to reducing rural poverty. Okay, so that was the change that happened from between the pre-reforms and the post-reforms period, right? Okay, the tertiary sector is also now important, right? But the secondary sector and the manufacturing sector also began to play a role in reducing poverty, right? But what was happening was, right? Okay, at the same time, inequality was also going up. Okay, right? So rural and urban inequality also increased. So what also happened in the same period was that inequality within rural areas, inequality within urban areas, as well as inequality between rural and urban areas, as well as regional inequality went up. Okay, so basically you had economic growth, which was poverty reducing, but more inequality creating. Right. So only a part of the Smith's liberal agenda was actually carried out. As we saw, there are two kind of strands in Smith's liberal agenda. Right, reducing poverty and also reducing inequality. So the Smith's agenda only partly carried out. Okay. So that's okay, right? So my worry that I have is a little bit more serious. Okay, you see what was driving economic growth itself. We know that economic growth led to poverty reduction, which is fine. But why did economic growth happen in the first place? Did it happen through the Smithian process that we have actually thought about? That greater division of labor, greater expansion of markets, and a synergy between the two, which leads to increase in productivity. So was increased productivity in better technology better division of labor, better organization of industry? Were these the factors driving economic growth in India in the post 90s? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. Right? What really drove high Indian economic growth is because the world economy was booming. The world economy itself was booming, yeah, and that contributed to a very large extent to the growth of the Indian economy in the 2000s, right? So basically, yes, it's true that economic growth led to poverty reduction, right? But economic growth itself did not happen the way Smith would have wanted it to, right? It was happening because the rest of the world was undergoing fast economic growth by and large, right? So that was my first concern. Secondly, what happened after 2012 was the world economy after the 2008 particularly and slowly later on, the world economy stopped growing as fast and the Indian economy also stopped growing as fast. Yeah. So for example, if you look at the data from 2005 to 2011-12, as we have said, a lot of people were pushed out of poverty. Yeah, and they came to be not from, they came to be not poor. From being poor, they came to be not so poor or started to go into the lower middle classes. Right? There is actually a very famous paper by Banerjee and Duplo, right, which kind of tries to find out what is common across the middle classes, in the middle classes across the world, and they define certain consumption boundaries. Right, so people who consume less than $2. So for example, the most middle classes around the world would have a daily consumption of $4 to $10 per capita in a purchasing power parity basis in I think 1993 prices, and then so they've created these limits about expenditure limits which are used to classify whether people belong to are poor or whether they belong to the lower middle class or they belong to middle class or they belong to upper middle class or the rich. Right. So if you use the Banerjee definitions, something very striking emerges. And if you look at what happened to India during this phase, right? So for example, the size of the middle class according to the Banerjee definition had remained more or less similar, constant, up to 25-26% of India till about 2004-5. But in 2011-12, 50% of the Indians began to belong to this middle class. Yeah, and in urban areas, it became 75%. Right, so very large part of India began to be not poor in the lower middle classes. And how had this happened? What you see in these papers, right? A large increase in the service sector. For example, we did some primary studies in Mumbai to find out where these middle classes were coming from. And we found that they were essentially people growing in the informal sector because the informal sector was flexible enough, right, to respond quickly to growth opportunities. So you could have somebody who, for example, had a small catering business and the catering business simply grew. The whole business was informal. But this person now was, he started his business from a very a small kind of a shanty and now had say maybe 2 vans and 15 employees under him, was actually middle class, right? So, and we found that mainly activities like construction, street vending, right? These are the activities which are driving the growth of the middle class in India, right? In urban India, yeah. And this happened across the spectrum, right? So this happened across class spectrum, caste spectrum, etc. ST scheduled tribes also became middle classes. Scheduled caste communities became middle classes. OBCs became middle classes. So this happened across the board, right? So this whole board across the board middle classization of India, which happened in the period 2005 to 2011-12. And I think it was this middle classization of India which also led to a political change in the political regime, because this is all a very aspirational middle class. They were growing up and they were more or less convinced that it was the inaptitude of the existing government and corruption which was actually the hurdles in their way. And the BJP also managed to kind of package a discourse, right? And so this middle class bought into that and there's a political regime change. Now, with the slowing of economic growth and especially of urban growth and especially construction, right, construction activities, again, because the world economy slowed down largely, actually these processes have now stopped. Right. So my second concern would be that not only were these processes, that's median growth, which was happening in India and the power tradition happening in India, not really endogenously driven, but was largely driven by the world economy, and therefore could not put in place processes which were permanent and self-sustaining. The kind of processes which Smith envisaged. Right. And because they were not, now we actually have data on, I mean, we don't really have comparable data because the 2017 NSSO consumption expenditure rounds, which would have helped us to compare what happened in 2011-12 to 2016-17, the data has never been put in the public domain. And for whatever reasons, we don't know. But so we don't really have a comparison. But slower economic growth, slower urban economic growth, okay, slowing down of rural wages definitely points to slowing down of this process in the country. Okay, slowing down of this process in the country, and I think the last 2 years have actually been devastating for would have been devastating for any country, and they have been for the Indian economy, especially for the informal sector, which was critical in kind of driving economic growth. The tertiary sector, as we have seen, right, the manufacturing sector, industry, as we have seen in Gaurav Dutt and Ravilian's paper, these became important in 1991 for driving economic sort of their impact on economic on poverty. So I think there must have been, if you actually have an analysis of consumption around data, expenditure data now, you'll find not only a significant reduction in poverty, but also significant reduction in the rate of poverty reduction. Right, a significant. You'll only not only find that the rate at which poverty was declining has fallen substantially. You'll also probably find that poverty has increased in some pockets, at least, especially scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, aspirational districts, backward states, compared to 2011-12. Right, that would be my contention. I have no way of testing that contention as of now, but we don't have the data right now. But if you have the data, that probably would be that's what my kind of hunch would be. So the concern that rises is that, of course, economic growth reduces poverty, but what creates economic growth in the first place? Right. Okay. In India, we have sort of put a great deal of emphasis on understanding the linkages between fast economic growth and poverty reduction. But we really need to put in place some understanding of actually what creates economic growth, what creates economic. So there are two things about economic growth that we must now worry about. One is what actually generates economic growth, right? What makes economic, and what would make that economic growth? So what generates economic growth, and what are the processes required to make that economic growth self-sustaining? So what would lead to continuous economic growth? It's kind of which kind of feeds on itself and grows. Secondly, what would be required to make this economic growth reach the poor, right, and reduce inequality? So what is it that would actually ensure for us the Smithian agenda, right? And there are going to be two things, I think. One approach has been our approach. So there are two approaches to that kind of a thing. One is economic growth, which is stock driven, right? So you build big roads, you start large industries, right? And then you have economic growth, and you then think of trickle down. And I'm going to talk a lot about trickle down in this process. So from where the idea came, how you thought about this idea, whether it works, what are the limitations, and also growth from below. Right. So I think what has been neglected in our literature, and want to be critical, is generating growth from the bottom of the pyramid. Right. I think we must think a lot about how you would actually make growth impulses flow upwards. Right. So you have one set of growth impulses which come from top down. Another set of growth impulses need to grow from bottom up. And at some point they would merge in a synergistic fashion. right? And that is what we really need to think. And that is where I think Smithian growth patterns would be very, very relevant, right? That's where we could actually be able to put in place, because there is a lot of low hanging fruit, especially at the bottom of the pyramid. But there is a challenge. When you think of harnessing the fruit at the bottom of the pyramid, what seems to be the need of the day is a lot of them have to do with what we economists call common pool resources, right? So resources which are neither completely private, neither completely public, right? So for example, environmental resources, forests, rivers, right? Forest products, and so on, which are going to be critical, and therefore we need to evolve in understanding how to deal with commodities for which neither markets nor states would work, i.e. markets in situations where communities which are halfway between the state and the market are crucial. And so organizing communities, working with communities is going to be critical to harnessing the bottom, if you really want to. And then if you can put those institutions in place, then you will be creating grounds which are fertile for Smithian kind of growth. Right. So in the next lectures now we'll talk about how, for example, how that kind of a challenge can be needs to be tackled, and how does the whole idea of trickle down growth come about, what is its history, how do you kind of challenge it, does it work, not work, right? And how do you kind of create self-sustaining economic growth? What are the challenges, and how probably you need to look at policy differently, right? So thank you, folks, so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Hello,
you, sir.
and if you have any questions, please send them in. And last week, I've been using a book which is called Adam Smith in His Time and Hours, right? Jerry Z. Mueller, right? It's a book by Jerry Mueller, Jerry, Muller, Mueller, Adam Smith in His Time and Hours. I think which is a very important book that you must all read. And if you also can get your hand on this book called The Economist's Art, right? So this book, if you can kind of get your hands on, uh,
So can
yeah,
you
if you
please
can
just
actually,
repeat it?
yeah, can you see this book,
Yes, sir.
The Economist's Art, right? It's a man called Benjamin Applebaum, right? And you really see how the kind of macroeconomics that you study, for example, you will see the political guys behind those curves. Right. So what looks abstract and scientific is generally never so. Right. It's always deeply political. Right. And therefore, economic policy is very much a political kind of right. So that's something that you must look at. Right. So I'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.